Okay, well, shalom. My name is Rabbi Johnny Solomon, and I'm delighted to be speaking with Rabbi Yaakov Nagen to talk about his book, The Soul of the Mishna. Here we have it here, which was recently translated by Magid in partnership with Yeshivat Otniel from Rabbi Yaakov Nagen's original Hebrew book, Nishmat Mishna, which I also have here, published by Dvir in 2016. So firstly, welcome, Rabbi Nagen, and I'd like to begin by asking you about yourself. What is your background? Where did you grow up? And aside from the book, which we'll get to momentarily, can you tell us about what you do, where you work, and some of the interesting projects you're involved with?
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Solomon. Grateful to be with you today. I grew up on the west side of Manhattan. I'm a graduate of YU and also a Musmach from REITs. But in the early 90s, I made Aliyah. My wife is a Tzavra, so even though I'm a Echadas, my children are fourth generation. Wow. I live in the town of Otniel, which is a yishuv south of Hebron, in the hills of Hebron. Where for 24 years I've been teaching at the Hesder Yeshiva of Otniel. Otniel is well known in Israel, on one hand, very for its openness. In many ways, a lot about connecting different worlds together, whether it's the academic world, classical alumnus. Otniel, for other reasons, it's been well known in Israel since tragically we've been a site of a lot of the terror during the last 20 years. In fact, this week I was at the memorials for 4 of our students who were killed in a terrorist attack on Parshat Shemot in the yeshiva itself. And I think part of the standing to terror in these difficult conditions and in confronting also death of people that are very valuable leads to the search for meaning, which characterizes a lot of my work and books, feeling that asking questions in particular about meaning and significance about life, I feel of these events have really guided my writings, including in the book of the Soul of Mishna.
Wow. Wow, I'd never realized how those different geographic associations shape, shall we say, your ideology. Just before we go on, so you've told us that you teach in the yeshiva and you've been there for quite some time. But I also know that you do other projects, I think, beyond the yeshiva. So
yes,
can you tell us a little bit about them?
Please. Despite, or perhaps even because we're in such an area surrounded by Arabs and confronting terror, I'm also very involved with interfaith initiatives. A major figure in our yeshiva was the late Rabbi Menachem Fruman. And one of his great insights, if religion is part of the problem in the Middle East, it'll have to also be part of the solution. Religion and our belief in the Rabbono Shel Olam could be a force to separate people if we feel that the other is serving a foreign, different God. But we believe that also this could be a way to connect us, to realize that ultimately, the way both Islam acknowledges Jewish belief in Hashem Echad, and Judaism acknowledges Islam's belief in the unity of God, and seeing ourselves as a part of the story of Avram Avinu, we believe that person-to-person encounters, developing that story could ultimately have the religious dimension as a way to connect us and not separate us. And everybody knows the bad parts about what's happening in Hebron, but I know that it's the other dimensions. I've been in interfaith meetings with the leaders of the Jewish community of Hebron, including the spokesperson, Noam Arnon, in homes of leaders in the Arab part of Hebron, of those who do seek connection. And part of that connection comes from our shared religious and also ethnic identities.
You said so much there. The quote that you said of Rabbi Froman is pretty much also word for word from the teachings of Rabbi Sachs, who was one of my teachers, with that vision that religion can be and probably should be part of the fabric of how we bring communities together. And rather than throwing away that shared language, our task is to find the messages which overlap and use them to both not just break bread, but initiate conversations. As he used to say, when conversation ends, violence begins. But that means our task is to keep on talking. And Torah, of course, is really what helps us communicate ideas and values. And if we can demonstrate that to our brothers and sisters in the region, there is a lot of hope. And I want to say publicly how much I appreciate the work that you do. We don't know each other that much individually, and I'm really pleased with this opportunity. But as somebody who follows the work that you do, it really is enlightening and inspiring, and really is a beacon of light, which is often overlooked, but certainly I think helps us understand the ways towards a healthier and better and safer future. So thank you.
Okay.
Now, moving on.
Let me mention, if you have mentioned you've studied by Rabbi Sachs, he of course is a great inspiration, not only on the interfaith issues, but even I feel, I mentioned before about the search for meaning.
Yeah.
And Rabbi Sachs, whose insight, as he says, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. Mm-hmm. And his belief that Judaism and our messages should be shared with humanity, he has really been a great guiding light for me. So we have yet something more in common.
Well, just to give you a heads up and to our listeners, I've just finished this 2 days ago, a vast collection of 1,600 quotes from 37 of his books, which I've organized by topic, which I'll be sharing in the coming days for everybody to enjoy. But those quotes, such as the one you just mentioned, are incorporated therein, as well as a section actually on meaning itself, because that's something that he very much encouraged us to do. Anyway, we'll talk about that another time. Let's talk about Nishmat Mishna, the soul of the Mishnah. So can you tell those listening what they'll find in the soul of the Mishnah? Is it a commentary on all the Mishnah or just some? Is it a book where you've collated different mefarshim, different commentaries on the Mishnah, or one where you showcase less well-known approaches to the study of Mishnah?
Okay, so let me first preface with a few words about the Mishnah itself. The Jewish people are known often as the people of the book. Mm-hmm. Originally, the book meant one book, the Tanakh. It took another almost 1,000 years till the second book came around, the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is referred to as, by the Medrash, as the iron pillar of the oral Torah. Mm-hmm. And I feel the Mishnah is a masterpiece, but it's, in some ways it's a lost masterpiece because of another Jewish masterpiece, the Talmud, the Gemara. We've often lost the ability to look with fresh eyes at the Mishnah as a masterpiece that stands in its own right. So part of the goal of my book is to reclaim that masterpiece. So what I do in the book, there are about 70 chapters in which I deal with about 200 Mishnayot, according to the order of Shas. And there I try to see what happens when we look at the Mishnah as a masterpiece in its own right, and to get meaning and values and significant statements of the Torah Sheba'al Peh about critical issues of Judaism and life in a direct encounter with the Mishnah. So that is so that's the structure of the chapters, but it's really looking at the Mishnah as much as from to feel the experience is coming from the Mishnah itself, not a commentaries that will sometimes take it to other places. Certainly not the Mishnah only as a jumping board for the Talmud or a way to get some basic facts about the Torah Sheba'al Peh, but rather to reclaim it as the masterpiece it should be.
Beautiful, really beautiful. And you should know that before the English version came out, I already previously purchased the Hebrew, the original Nishmat Mishnah, and I personally had quoted it on a couple of occasions in my Daf Yomi Insights, and it's really an exquisite book which pays attention to the things that people often overlook, but as going back to that word we used before, meaning, finds meaning in what may be on first glance a mundane law or misunderstood law or teaching, and teaches us how that can be applied to our life. So thank you. Those reading the book will note that there is a dedication right at the beginning, a dedication to a young man, Dvir Emanuelinov, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about Dvir and how his story gives us insight about what you're trying to achieve in the soul of the Mishnah.
Yes, I feel the story of Dvir sanctifies the book and its message. Dvir Emanuelov was the first soldier who fell in Ofrat Yitzukah, which was the first campaign that Israel launched to stop the missile attacks from Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
I never met him, but after the war, his mother called me and said that there's something that I should know, that Dvir's father had died a year before, about a year earlier. And after that, the first edition of my book, The Soul of Mishna, came out in Hebrew. And he saw the book and he started having a chavruta with his mother every Shabbat that he would come home from the army. And no matter how tired they were, the mother said they would always keep the limud. And then she says, do you know what the last Mishnah that we studied together before Dvir died? And even though I didn't, without even thinking, somehow the first edition had more than 100 Mishnayot, but I knew what she was going to tell me. She said the last Mishnah we studied was the Mishnah in Kedushin that tells us about two categories of mitzvot in family relations. First, the mitzvot of the father to the son, the mitzvot of the son to the father. And in my book, I argue that there's an intertextual connection between the mitzvot ha'av ha'ben, the mitzvot ha'ben ha'av, to the closing verse of Sifrei Nevi'im that says that the mission of Eliyahu Navi in the world is Veheshiv lev avot al banim velev banim al avotam, bringing the hearts of the fathers to the sons to the fathers, and saying that the Mishnah is saying, how do we get the hearts together? It's by fulfilling our roles, which are defined through the mitzvot. So the last Mishnah they studied together was a Mishnah talking about connection between parents and children in memory of his father, in connection to his mother. So it added tragic and meaningful significance to their joint study. And in fact, in his memory, for every week, for every Shabbat Mevarchim, meaning once a month, the community of Givat Zev would come together, study one chapter of the book, and someone would always have to try to connect the message of that chapter to the life of Dvir. I was there when they had the Siyum. Took 4 years and 2 months, because their first edition had 50 chapters, to close that particular limud.
Wow, that's remarkable. You know, I'll tell you something about that Gemara in Kiddushin. It's one which I've taught on a number of occasions. There's a parallel of the Braita in the Mechilta, which has an extra line that's not found there. It says there is a duty of a parent to teach their child Yishuv Medina. In fact, it says Rebbe Omer, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi adds that a father or parent should teach their child Yishuv Medina, which is generally understood to be citizenship. Mm-hmm. Now, for whatever reason, that wasn't carried over into the Braita, but if you look up in the Mechilta, I think, if I'm correct, that's what you'll find. And when you're just describing that, and you're talking about a young soldier who was guided by the value of his mother and father, who was here defending this Medina and enabling the ability for you and I to live here, both of us, Olim. It just shows you how the values of a home are passed on to children, and the children are a legacy of those parents. And what a beautiful kiyum of the words in the Navi. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. And relating to the Mechilta, which I was not aware of, so I'm grateful to hear that.
Yes.
It connects very well to that last pasuk.
Yeah.
Because in that last pasuk, after it says, "Veheshiv lev avot al banim v'lev avotam," you have to connect the fathers and the sons. Pen avo vika et eretz cherem. If this doesn't happen, if we don't fulfill our role to the children, the land will be barren. And the Mechilta that you quoted so much explains that, because if we don't teach our children the Yishuv Medina, good citizenships, then the land will be barren.
Yes. Wow, what a connection. Thank you. You mentioned in your introduction to the soul of the Mishnah that you apply the literary method that you learned from your teacher, Rabbi Dr. Avram Wolfish. Can you give me an example of what that method looks like, how that can be applied to the study of Mishnah, and how you use it in the soul of the Mishnah?
Certainly. Let me mention that Rabbi Dr. Wolfish, his doctorate at Hebrew University was showing how literary methods, which have been recently more recognized, how valuable they are in the study of Tanakh, can also be used for Mishnah. And in fact, in my doctorate from Hebrew University in Jewish philosophy, I also dealt a lot with the Mishnah. What does it mean, a literary approach? Literary approach tries to look at the use of language itself. It's about looking at the structure of a chapter and many literary phenomena. One, for example, would be called word plays. What's a word play? A word play, the same text will use the same word, which keys the reader to connect it and therefore illuminate. For example, in the 4th chapter of Brachot, we talk about prayer. The beginning of the chapter tells us that whereas Shacharit, Mincha, and Musaf have set times, Tfilat Arvit Ein Lakeva. There is no fixed time during the night for when to say Arvit. Now, at first glance, you might think this is telling us that, and furthermore, the Gemara says Ein Keva means it's not an obligation. So at first glance, we say, well, Tfilat Arvit is a second-rate prayer, no set time, and you're not really obligated. But then you continue reading that chapter, and you get to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that Hoseh Tfilato Keva Ein Tfilato Tachanunim. Somebody who makes his tefillah keva fixed, his tefillah will not be supplication. So the Mishnah uses the word keva in 2 contexts. The first context, lack of keva might seem to be less serious. Later we realize that a non-keva, a non-fixed tefillah, is not second rate, it's of a different quality, a different value. It's spontaneous prayer, prayer by choice, which is different, but no less. And therefore, that was my jumping point to talk about how that chapter crafts together the 2 forms of tefillah. Tefillah whose power is its commitment and fixed aspect, to those tefillah whose power is the spontaneous, the flow that they have, and that's what gives it its meaning and significance.
Beautiful, beautiful. You are basically, as we try and do with Tanakh, you're arguing that the Mishnah almost explains itself if you pay enough attention to it.
Exactly.
This is how Rav Hirsch describes his whole etymological method, exegetical method. Not forget etymological, that's a different approach altogether, which certainly he's a proponent, but his exegetical method is to explain the Torah from within. And you're saying the Mishnah does this, but we've somewhat overlooked it. And paying attention, listening to the words of the Mishnah. And of course, the Mishnah is an oral text, if you could call it that. It's an oxymoronic term nowadays, but it's an oral series of teachings, which nowadays we encounter in a text, but we've failed, it's at least in some way, or in some of us have failed to pay enough heed to the tonality, to the rhythm, to the notes of the Mishnah, because if we did so, we'd hear harmonies which are repeated in different Mishnayot. That's a really, really beautiful idea.
Exactly, right. And maybe one important methodology I would add is we're learning Mishnah from the inside of the Mishnah, but I think the greatest help source would be the Tanakh, because realizing that the only book available in the Mishnah is the Tanakh means that it's not just the few times that the Mishnah quotes the Tanakh. That's rare. Rarely are psukim directly quoted. But this is a frame of reference for images, for ideas and sources. So in many times, such as the example I gave you with Dvira Manuelov, that there's a Mishnah, mitzvot ha'av ala ben, mitzvot ha'ben ala av, and even though it's not explicitly quoted, there's a backdrop of the pasuk in Nevi'im.
You know, that's so right, because there are those who explain that, and to use a fancy term applied by people like David Weiss Halivni, the apodictic style of the Mishnah is a deliberate disconnect from Mikra, from the Tanakh, as opposed to Midrash Halacha. What you're saying is it may well not invoke biblical verses, but they're there under the surface. And if you pay enough attention, you'll be able to use those verses to be able to explain the Mishnah, because of course they're an inspiration not only for the laws in the Mishnah and the values, but even the style, where you have this parallelism of wordplay and literary methods that can be seen both in the Tanakh as well as in the Mishnah. Very, very interesting.
Exactly. And part of the power of literature is when things are not explicit, meaning in literature, they don't tell you everything directly. It's giving this feeling of something beyond, something not explicit, which makes literature and as powerful as it should be.
Right. Now, in fact, I think we may well see an example of that right now, because I've read Nishmat and Mishna and seen the great translation that has been published by Maggid and Yeshivat Otniel. And an example I'd like you to share with our listeners is your insight, your approach to Mishnah Tamid, which some people may be less familiar with. In the English, it's a chapter titled My Beloved Knox, which I found to be particularly refreshing. And in so doing, can you explain to me how you see a connection between Mishnah Tamid and Shir Shirim?
Certainly. So first, as introduction, Mishnah Tamid, which is 7 chapters, it tells the story of a day in the life of the Beit HaMikdash. It begins with the night of the Kohanim going to sleep in anticipation of the morning, and it goes through one full day of the regular service in the Mikdash. It's told as a story, and I imagine a story to try to capture the hearts of all, to realize what a great loss we've had by the destruction of the Mikdash. Now, one thing I've noticed that throughout the Masechet, in many instances, there's a backdrop to the stories there, which is imagery taken from Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim is a love story on the surface between a man and woman, but Chazal's understanding between the Jewish people and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and often in the Midrashim connected to the Beit HaMikdash, which is seen as the arena of that direct, intimate connection between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, many of the stories that appear there, for example, in Shir HaShirim, the woman goes to sleep in anticipation for her lover to show up. He ultimately comes, kol dodi dafek. He hears the dofek, the knock on the door, pitchuli. He cries out, open the door. But she dilly-dallies until it's too late. She goes outside, it's already too late, he's gone, and the shomrim, the guards come, see someone wandering at night, it's suspicious, and they end up beating her, suspecting her of being some sort of a criminal. In Shir HaShirim, the Kohanim, as the woman, they go to sleep in the night. They even talk about them washing. They go to the mikvah, as the woman says that she washes. They take off their ketonet. But then early in the morning, at the crack of dawn, they hear the knock, dofek. The Mishnah uses the word dofek. In fact, the word dofek appears only once in Tanakh, called the dofek, and only once in the Mishnah about the person who opens the Mikdash. He comes in the morning, dofek, he knocks on the door, but in the pasuk, he cries out, pitchuli, open up the door for me. And she doesn't. In the Mishnah, it says, potchimlo, they open up for him. They have their anticipation, they go, they open it up, and then they talk about the shomrim, the guards of the Mikdash, going and seeing that all is shalom, all is in peace. So throughout the Masechet, there's much imagery. They talk later about the Kohen, the first person to enter the Mikdash. And it says, Lo yeru'im oto v'lo shomim kolo. They do not see him, they do not hear him. Like in Shir HaShirim, there's a call, Har'eni et mar'ayach, tishmeni et kolech. Let me see let me see you, let me hear you. So many of the words, the imageries are throughout this Masechet to really give us feeling of that powerful images and emotions in this encounter with the Mikdash. In fact, there's 7 chapters in Tamid. So the middle chapter is chapter 4. Chapter 4 has 3 Mishnayot. So of course, the middle chapter is Mishnah Bet. And the middle, they talk about opening up the heart of the Korban when they're bringing it as an offering, giving a feeling that we've gotten really to the heart. So this is an example, again, of literature, of intertextual analysis to see the under the surface, this story that animates and gives meaning to what the Mishnah is telling us about why the service of the temple was so important.
And you express it so beautifully in that chapter. I was very much moved by it. It really transformed how I looked at the Mishnah and the whole service. In fact, while you're talking, apologies, I just had to stop a machine from making a noise to my right. It occurred to me that though you're speaking about the structure of the Bet HaMikdash and it being a reflection of the narrative that we see in Shir HaShirim, we also see that somewhat in time, where at least nowadays, absent of the Bet HaMikdash, my Holy of Holies is Shabbat. And of course, we read Shir HaShirim, or many people read parts of Shir HaShirim Erev Shabbat, and we prepare ourselves, dress ourselves, cleanse ourselves, and try and enter into that time that was, of course, in that time, a place, and we still ache for the Bet HaMikdash, but where we haven't got a makom, we try and sanctify place, in sanctify time instead of place. So, okay, that's beautiful.
Well, one thing I will, if I can mention something also from the book about that, we know that Rabbi Avram Yeshua Heschel would talk much about sanctifying space, Shabbat as space, as time instead of space. But in Shiva, in particular, the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Re'ema Cohen, always talks about Shabbat is also about place. Our first encounter with Shabbat, even before Aseret Debrot, tells us by the Parsha of the Man in Bashalach, and it says, Al Yitzei Ish Mikomo, don't go out of your place. In fact, so much of Shabbat and Erevin, which is really a unit, it's really about place. Stay rooted in your place. You can't go out of the Tchum Shabbat. You cannot take objects out of the Reshut HaYachid. In fact, that's why, again, in my first chapter about Shabbat, I talk about the Mishnah Yitziot Shabbat as the beginning, because this is connecting to Al Yetzei Ish Komo, which was the first encounter of the Jewish people at Shabbat. So Shabbat is about time, but it's also about place. Being rooted in your place.
Well, you mentioned YU, and I was recently teaching my students in Midrash at Lindenbaum the essay by Rav Soloveitchik titled Sacred and Profane, where he emphasizes both the importance of sanctity in time and sanctity in place. And I thought perhaps that was a critique of Heschel, who emphasized one over the other. And the Rav is basically saying, no, we need both, but as you say, they are connected. That's itself an interesting essay and worthwhile considering the relationship between those two great thinkers living at the same time. You mentioned, well, it's quite clear from Nishmat Mishnah and the soul of the Mishnah that you're trying to encounter the Mishnah broadly on its own terms. That means you don't ignore the Gemara, but certainly you're trying to make sense of the Mishnah unto itself. This is an endeavor that I very much agree with and of myself adopted in different times. Why do you think that's so important? Meaning, if you purchase a classic Mishnah commentary today, we can mention the names, but most of them are trying to give you explanations of the Mishnah refracted through the later Talmudic discussion. Why do you think it's important to say, we know that happens, but it's important to look at this literature unto itself?
Right. Okay, so I feel it's also a question, what are we looking for? Meaning, in the Gemara, the Mishnah is a jumping board to ultimately to clarify the halachic laws that come out of the Mishnah, to define them. Now, that's, of course, a worthy role and something which, of course, that I spend most of my time doing, teaching in a yeshiva. But I feel our times there's a dimension of looking for meaning and significance. And that being the case, the Gemara often doesn't deal with the issues and questions that I deal with, but it's not in contradiction. I could give one example. So for example, at the beginning of the Mishnah, they talk about the time of when to say Kriyat Shema in the morning. So the Gemara will deal with about when to say it, but the point that the fact that the halacha is according to Rabbi Yeshua, who says that uf kumecha, when you wake up, is even 3 hours into the day, when he says the reason is because children of kings wake up 3 hours into the day. So for me, that tells me a message that the Jewish people, we are children of kings. We are Bnei Yisrael, Bnei Melachim, because we are children of God, as Rabbi Akiva says, that Chaviv Yisrael Shnikru Bnei Makom. Now, the Gemara doesn't relate to that. It's not, I'm not disagreeing, of course, with the Gemara, but it's finding a different dimension. And our age, I feel, is an age that people are looking for meaning. I could even link this to a famous essay of Rav Kook. He says that there's the Chacham and the Navi. Tanakh is the time of the Navi, the prophet. The prophet is giving us vision and significance. The later times is times of the Chacham. The Chacham is working on the nitty-gritty of halacha and life. And Rav Kook says that ultimately we have to connect them together. Just like Moshe was both a Chacham and a Navi. And he said, in return to the land of Israel, we will link together the Chacham and the Navi. And I see by studying the Torah Sheba'al Peh and searching for meaning and significance, this is linking the Chacham and the Navi. This is Torah Eretz Yisrael.
So beautiful. You mentioned Moshe. We're just Erev Shabbat Parshat Va'era, and though we can see Moshe as being both, but also that partnership that's emphasizing Va'era between Moshe and Aaron further emphasizes this importance of both adding and both being part of our redemptive process. So thank you so much for that. I was going to tell you something, but you mentioned something that I want to come back to. No, I'm having a senior moment. So I'm going to move on. And you write in the Soul of Mishnah in the introduction that although I teach in the yeshiva, I believe the main arena for the revelation of the Torah is outside the walls of the Bet Midrash, in the broader circles of the Jewish people. So I want to ask you, what do you mean by that?
Okay, I think part of the power, right when at Mamad Har Sinai, we are told that Am Yisrael are Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. I feel that the role of Am Yisrael as Kohanim means that the place of Torah, it's not, we don't just have our rabbis who are like priests, and not just saying that students in yeshiva or midrasha, this is not the arena, cannot be the sum total of where is the place of the Torah in Am Yisrael. Torah is in Am Yisrael in the totality of our life and existence, and therefore it can't just be about the yeshivot and the Beit Knesset. But if we ask what parts of Torah are relevant to be part of the totality of Jewish life, we know that certain models that are appropriate for yeshiva, learning Gemara Be'iyun, is something which is hard to replicate during the flow of life. But I feel that something which is very relevant to say that a book such as the Mishna, which is in easy Hebrew, it's short, it's something which can be so relevant for part of what is the Torah relevant for family life, home life. So Mishnah has a tremendous potential. The challenge is, if you don't know what to do with Mishnah, it could be dry and boring in some ways. But if Mishnah could be people could be trained to see Mishnah as a meaningful experience, that when you learn the Mishnah, your mindset is critical. Even if you don't have the literary methodologies that I use, but just reading Mishnah and asking questions, what is this teaching us? What is this telling us? Could create rich discussions that can make Mishnah, which is short, easy Hebrew, to the point, to be something meaningful in studying, whether with parents and children, like the story of Dvir Emanuelov, in communities. So I feel that enriching Mishnah, calling people to look differently at Mishnah, could reclaim a book that could be so relevant to Torah in the context of family and community.
I so agree with what you said. There's been, we see inflation in economics. So there's become inflation in Jewish learning. What I mean by that was, a couple of hundred years ago, the average Balabais would learn Mishnah. They wouldn't claim to be a Talmudist or an expert in the Paiskim. There'd be a Chevat Lomdesh Mishnah of whichever group, the Schneiders and the printers, etc. And they'd proudly do so, and they'd learn, and that'll be part of their avodah in learning, and it would be a text that they would own, and they'd have a sipuk, a sense of accomplishment in completing. I often feel that we try and achieve so much and yet reach so little. And Mishnah is a reachable outcome, meaning people try and learn the whole library of Jewish learning and often find themselves frustrated. They don't quite achieve the end of any individual work or set of works. But the Mishnah very much is part of that. And rather than nowadays people thinking that Mishnah is just for younger people or just for this or just for a certain ritual learning, we'll get to that in my final question, I think we need to return back to an appreciation of Mishnah as an important Jewish text, which, as you say, as you've explained so beautifully, explains itself. And if we can apply certain tools to see fresh insights in the Mishnah, it will very much engage all those who probably will get more out of learning Mishnah than necessarily trying to get some out of learning other works where they may well encounter moments of frustration. So that inflation, which often occurs where something was worth something at some point, is nowadays sometimes thought to be worth less, not worthless, but worth less, I think needs to be restored, with Mishnah being something that all Jews should be learning and have some kind of meaningful ownership on. I remembered, by the way, I'd forgotten, what the Gemara does to the Mishnah, I often think, is something like what the Minchat Chinuch does to Sefer Chinuch. The Sefer Chinuch and the Mishnah are very, very poetic works, which incorporate law but also values. And then we overlay really important commentaries which deal with details which certainly need to be understood. But in so doing, sometimes the poetry can get overlooked, and it's important that we connect with those raw texts, namely Mishnah, Sefer Chinuch, or even sometimes, you mentioned Shir Shirim, what a beautiful text, which sometimes can be misunderstood when we overlay commentaries on that and pay less heed to the knocking of those beautiful words. I want to end with a final question. One of the reasons why you call your book The Soul of the Mishnah, Nishmat Mishnah, is because famously the same letters of the word Mishnah spell the word neshama, which is why it's customary to study Mishnah when somebody has passed away. In fact, you acknowledge that in the back of both the Hebrew and the English, where you have the alphabet. You list which Mishnayot start with different letters, because it's customary to study Mishnayot to spell out the name of a loved one. So given this, do you have any suggestions of enriching our general study of Mishnah, and in particular, but not exclusively, of course, our study of Mishnah when doing so for the aliyah of the neshama of a loved one?
Okay. Well, again, the general suggestions, as I said, the book tries to demonstrate ways of looking at Mishnah. And as I said before, in addition to any methodologies, the very decision, let me look at the Mishnah and respect it as a work in its own right and ask questions and look for meaning, that itself could be transformational. Now, in terms of Iloi Nishmat, numerous times when I give a shiur in memory of somebody, I do as what's traditional. I choose the Mishnayot based on the letters of the person's names, which takes me only a minute because I have my index at the end of the book. And I'm able to give a very meaningful and not just a technical shiur, which he feels connected to the person because it is the letters of their names. And since the Mishnayot and the way I deal with them so much give meaning, invariably there'll be something in those Mishnayot connected to the person who I'm giving the shiur in their memory. But maybe, in fact, and maybe I'll end with this story, the publication of Nishmat Mishnah came about because of an event like that. One of my students, his grandmother passed away, and during the Shiva, between Mincha and Arvit, he would teach Mishnayot in memory of his grandmother. And he said people came back every day not because they felt that they had to continue giving the respects, but they wanted to hear the more Mishnayot from him. And these weren't Mishnayot that I had studied with the student, but because the student had incorporated the methodology, whatever he was teaching would have those messages. And then ultimately his father, in memory of the grandmother, pushed me to put out what was ultimately the first edition of Nishmat Mishnah. So this is maybe a good way to end our meeting together.
Well, so all I can say is these have a prized place on my shelves. I've studied Nishmat Mishnah and enjoyed so many of the insights. I'm delighted that the English-speaking world now have this really exquisite book with actually a stunning cover. When my daughter came in a couple of days ago to my office, she said, "What a beautiful book." And I said, "Thank you." So the Soul of the Mishnah is now available to be purchased from Magid on their website, Jewish bookstores around the world. Thank you so much, Rabbi Nagen, and I wish you bracha v'atzlacha and all the important work that you're doing. And
you too.
Please God, these Mishnayot will be a source of great interest and discussion around the Jewish world.
Okay, thank you.
Kol tov.